topic for this week. We kind of went back and forth, and you had some conflicting, thoughts in terms of where you kind of wanted to take the content from here, Christian. And it was having last week having left off on some practices, some habits, some good ideas and things that we could start to implement. I'm really excited to kind of start to, well, not only tie those things into some of the content I'm looking here at the agenda and looking forward going, oh, these are some of the things we're going to be talking about over the next few months. I think, we're gonna find that what you established for us last week now actually has a little bit more practical application to some things that people can start studying and using and applying those practices that you outlined to some of these concepts. And I guess the theme this week would be meta narratives, but I don't want to take too much time. I'll let you kind of tee us up and kind of run with it, and I'll just interject if there's something I've got to say. But please, time's yours.
Yeah, I think you're right. We went back and forth. Maybe I'll try to convey the struggle that I think has been going on a little bit to anybody that ever, listens to this or sees it. We're reading a book by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. It's called Cynical Theories. Um, and really the big point of that, I've read it. I know we're working through it together, but I've read it already, and I think after going through it again, it's very interesting, regardless of what you believe. It starts to dissect and really evaluate in a pragmatic kind of way viewpoints that people use in order to understand reality. And last week, what I kind of told you, incompletely was, well, you just need to understand reality. It's like, well, how? And what
Right.
does that mean? Like, what is the reality? And I was like, well, I think a lot of this stuff is kind of baked in. I use that term a lot. Like when I eat a cake, I don't think about the eggs. Were they grade A? Were they grade double A? What was the butter they used? Like a lot of this stuff is just kind of implied or assumed. And because it's been that way, to be honest with you, in the Western civilization, probably since like just barely past the Enlightenment, like way back hundreds of years ago. And so some of this stuff is really hard to tease out and extrapolate because it's so foundational to just everyday things that we do. When we talk about politics, the way that that's shaped is based on what we call the meta narrative, essentially the pattern that defines and explains how we view the world. And I can give you more of a concrete like definition of that, but I want to explain what it looks like before exactly what it is. I think the politic, maybe I jumped the gun, but when we talk about politics, that's within a certain framework that's been established for us. Like we don't question the framework we use very often. Or when we talk about Christianity and like the general concepts that are commonly talked about, we don't really question how they fit in. If we were looking at an actual broken down piece by piece by piece, that's kind of just it's assumed or taken for granted. We just know it's there without talking about it all the time. And I think the risk that we run by doing that is we lose the value of what the structure is actually providing us. And so that book does a really good job explaining that not everyone sees it the same way. And what we ought to do is break that down, evaluate it, and determine how effective, how practical they are, and the results that come from them. So it's a very tall task,
Yeah.
and it's hard to really grapple with because it's so abstract and so foundational. So anyway, that's really where I was at.
And by, I guess, to kind of tie back to the vocab word you used, the things that are abstract and foundational that are, as you say, baked in, we're talking about into what specifically? Just, I mean, you would mention like religion, possibly politics. Are you saying kind of culture as a whole has these ideas and things that we often don't think about because they're just not the focal point of what we're paying attention to and hearing about? Is that kind of what you mean by that?
Yeah, we operate, in our daily lives, we make a series of decisions, we behave, we act with a certain way based on um I think an underlying structure that dictates how we see the world. And it's like you just pop into I mean, you just exist one day, like you're born
Right.
one day, and all of a sudden, as you get older, you kind of have to make sense of this. I mean, this enormous place that we live in, and the way that we talk, the way that we act, the way that we behave, the way that we think, the way our brains function, are all influenced by these big patterns, these big kind of grand ideas that shape everything else. It's like a really big umbrella. So to give you a contrasting example, like you and I, we're going to think very differently from a female in, I don't know, South Korea or India, or I don't know, even Eastern Europe,
Sure.
very differently. Well, we're going to think very differently. I mean, culturally, politically, religiously. And so the way that we operate our lives are going to be, sometimes consistent with one another, but sometimes very different. And we need to figure out, or at least talk about, why.
Yeah.
What are we using to guide, or what are we using as the structure to dictate how we act, how we think, what we talk, how we talk, the way that we interact with one another, the way that we view reality. So
You know,
that it's hard. It's not tangible. This isn't something you can like really get your hands on and wrestle with. It's way up here and stuff that I mean, for years and years, decades for me, I just wasn't thinking about this stuff. So it's hard.
when you put it like that, in the sense of just we think differently, and you mentioned some specific, a female in South Korea. I was actually I'd had a number of conversations this week with, well, being that I speak Spanish, I often the only
Sure.
practice I really get is with immigrants from other countries as I'm out and about and doing different things and whatnot. And I had a conversation
Yeah.
with a guy, and he speaks English, and he said, or we were kind of talking back and forth, and I was like, well, how do you think that you, I mean, what would you say the biggest difference between kind of your country and the United States? And he said, I couldn't even begin to describe the differences between
Yep.
my country and the United States. We
Yep.
speak different, we act different, we eat different things, we live in different types of houses. Like,
We think
there's
differently. We have different politics. We have different ideologies.
totally. And it was something that I kind of back to him. I said, that's really interesting that you say that, because having lived in Chile, it was something that I tried to relate to the people as best I could, but I always knew that I was going to miss the mark in some way because I hadn't experienced the same things they experienced. I hadn't grown up in the culture that they grew up in. There was just so many differences. And at the same point, I couldn't get rid of or forget the things I knew based on where I came from. The United States, I mean, there's a reason it's one of the most prosperous countries in every aspect, and to then go to
Ever.
a much less developed country and try and get on the same level as those people, this actually creates a lot more context. It now helps me understand, even just now you describing it that way, going, oh, it wasn't supposed to be easy to understand. In
Yeah,
fact,
that's
I
right.
could probably spend my whole lifetime trying to identify the differences in how, you and I were raised as white Christian males in the United States of America versus and insert any other set of circumstances in any other country, and it still would there would be so much complexity to the differences that we grow up in.
Good. So, yeah, and you pointed out something that's critical. So now, what do we do? And this is rhetorical, but what do we do when we have all of these people that look, talk, act, behave, think, have different religious beliefs differently? How do we all get along? How do we organize and structure ourselves where we can have, the most amount of good or the most amount of, depends on the framework you want to apply. For me, it's the most amount of freedom, the most amount of ability to, not be imposed upon by the government. How do we do that? How do we get along with one another? And often the risk we run is when we focus on the differences, we lose track of the similarities. And so that's for a conversation way down the
Yeah, yeah,
road.
yeah.
But I think, but we're getting to the heart of this. We have naturally, it's easy to identify differences. So how do we expect people to find a way that they can um, cogently and similarly interpret reality? It's hard. So I want to be clear though. These meta narrative, they're not philosophies. This is deeper than philosophy. The philosophy, I haven't quite figured out exactly how it fits in, but I'm thinking it's more of a byproduct of the meta narrative. You start at the meta, and the philosophies come out to try to help us understand the narrative, and then figure out how we're supposed to act in accordance with it.
Sure.
I think it flows downstream. So I'm still, that's going to take me some time
Yeah.
to really flesh that out. But I think that's the relationship. So to introduce, I mean, I'm going to start to shift gears unless you had something else
No,
to
go right
say.
ahead, please.
Okay. So I think it's important to kind of identify what some of these things are because we're still being really abstract. So labeling or titling things is important. So there's a few that I'll introduce and just kind of compare. There can be different metas in different categories. The meta narrative that you apply to politics is probably going to be slightly different than your cultural, going to be slightly different than your religious. It's just going to operate slightly differently. Hold on. Um, so just to title a few, so you've got things like liberalism that's popping up consistently in the book.
Right.
Um, you've got rationalism, you've got Marxism, you have religion, just generally, you have Christianity, Hinduism, Islam. Those things are going to have a different way of viewing the world we live in and the things that we ought to aim for and how we're supposed to understand those things. So, um, yeah, why do I think it matters? Well, it's important because that really I think is the baseline. That's the baseline understanding, and we kind of grow from there. I think once we have structure and understand the reality around us, you can start to identify competing narratives and the differences that are there. So, I mean, obviously, right off the bat, you've got, I mean, liberalism and Marxism are pretty,
Yeah.
those are pretty hard to, those are not parallel. Those cannot be run together, I don't think. You have the way that you view the world. If you're, a traditional liberal, and I want to clarify, I know I'm kind of bouncing around, but
You're good.
liberal, not in the context that, the politically or the ideological like word. Liberalism in the sense of like freedom.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about the relationship between those later on, um, but like human freedoms, freedom of speech, individual rights, and like how the law protects those is critical because that focuses, on the individual and them being the central or the core unit of exercising those rights. Whereas Marxism really focuses on it's a group framework um, driven by by group framework. I mean it's driven by class struggle and essentially really the imbalance of power. And if you put those together, if you're focusing on groups rather than individuals, well, those can't be, reasoned with one another or balanced one with the other. And then if you're focused on power rather than individuals having freedom, like those don't, you can't really align those two things. So that's what you're up against. It's not as simple as yeah, I'm guilty of this all the time, being like, oh, that's a Marxist theory. And it's like, well, what does that mean?
Right.
What does that mean? Define that. What's the risk? What do we actually live in? What ought we to be doing instead? Those are really important questions, and they take a lot of thought. I mean, you and I are going to work on that for 50 years probably.
Right.
So that's where we're at. And again, I'm still pretty new to this. You're pretty new to this, so there's lots of learning to be done.
Sure.
Any thoughts so far? If you don't, that's okay.
Not really. I'm kind of just taking it in a little bit. As you kind of say, most of these ideas I think are going to take a lot of diving into. I mean, you use two kind of you don't even put them opposing. You say that they're two separate things, liberalism and Marxism, which I think in most people's understanding based on what you said, if you describe liberalism as freedom, Marxism to some degree is the opposition to that. But I like the idea that you say, no, I think they're kind of totally separate, independent things. And yeah, maybe they have some overlapping features in how they kind of oppose one another in some senses. But I really am just kind of looking forward to
Okay.
going into those later. But I think, we're on
So
track.
what so I think it's important to clarify. Well, so when you have two like political meta narratives, it's really hard to be able to, well, you said they're one against the other. I think you have to, it's hard to say that you are a liberal while also endorsing Marxist framework. I don't think those are incompatible with one another.
Yeah.
So to say they're not directly opposed or that they're clashing underneath like what we live in right now, I think you see, I hate saying it's one or the other, but it might be. It's
Hmm.
either this or that. You either are a liberal or you are adopting a Marxist framework, and it's going to determine how you view things. I think one that kind of came to mind earlier was think of the French Revolution, and I'm not going to quiz you on your history, but
Yeah.
but what would the liberals say about that? What would a Marxist say about that? Well, I think the liberal viewpoint would be that that was a fight over the expansion of freedom and rights. Whereas the Marxists would say this was a struggling working class rising up to overthrow the feudal system.
Hmm.
So, what are the two takeaways there? Well, one is we're fighting over individual rights, or we're fighting over whether a class rose up and took out another class. That's a serious difference.
Right.
That is going to shape your framework. Are you starting at the individual as the core component, or are you starting at groups? And we're going to see that. I mean, the book does a really nice job fleshing that out when it gets to a number like intersectionality. What do you view as the core unit? So anyway, that's just kind of an introduction there, but it's critical because that affects what we view as the truth.
Yeah.
So we have to fight over that. We have to disagree and discover, what is the truth. One narrative suggests that it can be found, that it's objective and can be discovered, and one says it can't. What are the big takeaways? Well, the one that says it can, maybe we ought to pursue that. The other that says it can't, well, if nothing is objective and truthful, what are we supposed to do? What's the meaning of being here? Why do I care? And that's not in a flippant kind of, oh, why should I care? It's what's my big takeaway? What am I supposed to be doing?
Right.
I think that is a critical distinction. So it's not that I don't want to overemphasize, but I also don't want to underemphasize. This is a critical discussion that has to happen because this affects everybody well, maybe that's an exaggeration, but this affects the people that are trying to figure out how are we supposed to view the world? And if we disagree, how are we supposed to get along?
No, yeah, yeah,
I'm- so I think that that's going to, I don't have the answer to that,
yeah.
but we're going to have to, where we will work through it. So competing narratives is a good thing. According to one of the narratives, liberalism would actually, I think, would say it's a good thing. We'll get to the introduction of postmodernism, but depends on what you mean by compete. Something that I endorse, if I'm describing me, I am certainly a liberal in the true sense, a liberal Christian that endorses, rational thought, reasoning, and science. Because essentially I can test and it's like, well, that's kind of funny. Aren't everybody? No, not everybody believes in
Right.
those things. So, but what that can allow us to do is to test things. And if we can test things, we can, like I was talking about, use some pragmatic we can be pragmatic and view the results that come from those and make observations about them. Not all meta narratives want to do that.
Well,
So go ahead.
no, yeah, I think you brought up a good point. I remember a few years ago when we kind of did, if you will, a family home evening, and Dad kind of brought up the point. He said, a lot of times to figure out what you are, you have to know what you're not. And
Yep.
in as much as I think culturally, societally, and what's going on in our country and the world, people are trying to everyone says it's okay to identify or be something in particular, something specific, so long as, in a lot of cases, it aligns with whatever their agenda is, right? And that is a whole part of postmodernism that, we are eventually going to talk about. But, I think that there's value in what you just said, where it is almost in a lot of senses, well, a declaration, but a good thing to know where you stand, to know where you are, because in a lot of times I think it allows us to then begin to know what we're not and how to push back against the things that would oppose where we are, right? As you kind of we talk about these opposing ideas. If I'm a white Christian male that straight as well would be part of that, and all of those things, then it's pretty easy for me to identify what I'm not, which is anything that's not that. Not to say the color of my skin doesn't have really anything to do with that, but in the sense of there's a lot of things going on in our world that would say in direct opposition to what you and I are saying, in that I know what I am, and they would say, well, that's bad because of these reasons. But then we can say, okay, well, how do I need to frame the argument, the discussion, so that I can actually articulate it in a way based on what you're saying, testing things logically with reason, so that I'm not confused all the time as to why someone would be in opposition to where I stand, maybe. I don't know if I'm saying that the right way.
Yes. So there, yes, but so we can peel back another layer of analysis on that. We can get to I'm going to disrupt or dismantle the way you're even approaching this and saying you're getting ahead of yourself. First, we should start to talk about the way you're even thinking about these things
Sure.
and saying, well, if you're putting things into binary categories like male, female, or organized categories like race, why should we? Aren't these really just constructs that we come up with to help us figure out where we stand in society? And if we can undermine that point, then what you said is completely worthless.
Right.
Now it's just, no, it doesn't matter. And everything is about, maybe not everything, but the way we're going to approach things is the way we talk about it and structure the language, the groups is really all about power. And so there's inherently no value in figuring out where you lie because you've been privileged or blessed or whatever the entire
Right.
time to have the opportunity to be thinking about it this way. And that's what we're going to challenge. And if that is challenged and undermined, then what you just said is gone.
Doesn't
There's
matter.
no value
Yeah.
to that. So we have to, it's a hard thing to do, but we have to continue to peel back layers of analysis on this. And I'm not dismissing your point at
No,
all.
right. Yeah.
The meta, before we can answer the question or the stuff you just talked about, we have to establish where is the meta narrative and what is it.
Sure.
So and describe it and prove that there's value to that. So we've kind of, I mean, I wrote a few things down, but we kind of walked through this. There's different meta narratives politically, both religiously and economics, morally. I mean, I'm not sure how much value there is to just list things, but is it starting to kind of make sense? And tell me if I'm not doing it well. But I mean, do you see how this really is the umbrella that is shaping everything underneath in
And
the
yes, I think the point that you just made, and I kind of understood it from the beginning, but and I would say even from my own perspective is that I think too often we drill down too quickly, which is your
Yep.
point. Instead of
Yes.
staying broad and staying kind of abstract in a lot of
Mhm.
senses, more big picture, we try to get specific too fast, and that is where I think a lot of the undermining or disproving or all of those things can take place because opposing arguments are going to start broader first, and we are not. In my sense, I refer we as in me or people that are kind of like
I know
me,
what you
where we
mean.
might be a little bit confused or frustrated with things that are going on and we don't know how to talk about it right. And it's because we haven't even identified, to your point, these meta narratives, these big picture things that are m- really the foundation of all of it, but we don't ever talk about it. And that's part of the problem is that I had
Why?
never, up until this book, and maybe one or two conversations with you and Dad, had never even heard the word before.
Yeah.
And now having a little bit more context, I go, oh, a meta narrative is this really uh, broad idea that is very complex because it's made up of a lot of different things, but yet it's also very kind of specific based on all of those things that make up it, like religion and geography and your family situation, all of those things make up it, but at the same time, it's all individual based on kind of different people's answers to those questions.
So yes, that's true. And then what our job is because there's a number of different meta narratives that could be right, but it doesn't mean they are.
Sure.
So I'm not going, well, me being everyone, we don't have to sit around and endorse the wrong ideas. And it's actually brilliant that when opposing arguments that I'm familiar with pop up, really the postmodern arguments, it's brilliant that they undermine the narrative because if they can undermine the narrative and turn it into confusion and chaos and remove all sorts of like objective meaning, then it doesn't even have to be coherent.
Right.
It doesn't have to be cogent. It doesn't have to make sense. And so, really, it's smart. And I was kind of, maybe you missed it, but I was asking you why. Why is this important? Why are they going after that? Because this is so baked in to what we do every day that we don't have to think about it. And now they're questioning way up here what's going on. And everyone's like, whoa, we're not having that conversation, but they want to have this conversation. So we need to start having this conversation. And
Yeah.
then other things start to flow downstream from that. So that is the big issue. If we aren't talk operating within the same framework, we can't talk. There is no discourse. One way to maybe, a bad analogy would be if you're trying to strictly use logic to solve a problem, and I'm trying to strictly use emotion to solve a problem, we're not having the same conversation.
Right.
We're not operating by the same rules. We're not operating within the same framework. So that is where the argument starts. That is the baseline. That is the foundation. And then I think everything flows from there.
Sure.
So I think the big takeaway is meta narratives. Oh, I mean, I wrote down a definition.
Sure. Yeah, please.
Grand narratives are the overarching story or framework that explain how the world works, what is important, and what humans should aim for, and how it should be understood. And I think that's right. So as we start to essentially we have to now go through and go, okay, where are we? What do we live in? What are the arguments against it? What are the major competitors in this realm? Well, I guess we can just hop right in.
Sure.
I think
Yeah. Maybe this is kind of, we can kind of, the last few minutes that we have, maybe we tee up maybe the next conversation with what are some of these ideas, and then, based on what you think it would be the best next step, we can kind of dive into some of those things the next time. We have just a few minutes left.
so this is going to have to go back a few hundred years. This is the history that's important. when we look back towards the Enlightenment, towards, you know, the scientific, I don't even know, scientific evolution through the industrialization periods, those all have shaped what has come to be, known commonly as modernity, which is abstract. And then you have modern thought that is kind of what gives, it's kind of the byproduct of modernity, but also it's the context that helps us understand it. So I think the way I wrote it down, there was a way that I was thinking of this. So modernity is it's the social, cultural, and historical condition that developed roughly through the 17th to 19th century in Europe. And the things we get from that are rationalization, rational thought, reason, individualism, secularism starting to come through that naturally, the industrialization. So those are big historical like pillars of defining what modernity is. Modern thought really is what developed in response to it, but not in response like an opposite, not a reaction, but like a byproduct.
Product. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a byproduct. It refers to like the philosophical, scientific, and cultural ideals that underpin modernity. So it's what you use to exercise, or it's the exercise of those tools that kind of defines what the modern period is. So before that, I mean, it was there was a lot, and I don't think that's as relevant, but how people were discovering information, what their belief system, that really their understanding of um what's that word that I like to use all the time with an E?
Epistemology.
Philosophy, epistemology. Yeah, that's the word. So that's kind of what happened throughout that time period. That's what evolved from that. Then I depends probably on what you read and who you ask, but it's interesting the connection that started to rise up in the 30s. Then you start to have Marxism that comes in and tries to attack modernity, and critical theory starts to question and criticize. Well, I need to introduce more context. Really, I think America was shaped by that, Christianity, sense of liberalism, free, individuality and freedom. So I think, the framework I operate in, I think it's a liberal or a liberalism kind of meta narrative. And that I think that's evident, or there's strong evidence in various aspects of, our day-to-day life, and we can get into that later. But in the 30s, what started to happen is critical theory came out in the late 80s, or sorry, the late 1880s. You have Marxism, and when Marxism largely, failed, the Western experiment failed. Critical theory evolved to try to explain it and also further it, but also change it in a way. And so that leads eventually to postmodernism that arises in the 60s. And that's just kind of an interesting concept generally, because postmodernism literally means, after modernism.
Yeah.
So we have this period that is well defined, I think, as modern or modernity. And then the postmodernists start to go, we have evolved past this, and there are bad things that were coming because of it. And they question even the underpinnings of how it came to be. So there's a lot to unpack, and I just kind of vomited some information, but the history is really what we need to dissect. What happened? Why was it important? What did it lead to? And then what happened, more recently in the 20th century that has started to undermine that? Well, the 19th and 20th century.
And I guess to kind of create a little bit more of a to sum up what you said, if you will, is you're saying that in the 17th and 19th centuries, a lot, 17 through the 19th century, a lot of things were kind of changing and evolving, which then affected the mid 20th century, kind of the 30s through the 70s,
Well,
80s.
that's a good clarifying question. It was a process that was going on the whole time. I mean, think back, into your history when you had the Enlightenment period. Then you have, the scientific evolution that's going on at the whole time. Well, maybe not the whole time, but that's coming. You have the industrialization period that's going on. So technology is changing, science is changing, the way we think about things is changing, and it's ongoing. It's really not like a this happened
Right.
period. It's a this is happening, and here's the influence and the result that came because of that.
Well, and I guess to kind of sum up your point is you're saying not only these things are going on, the meta narrative that people live within during these all of this constant change and evolution and growth in probably the most condensed period of time in the history of mankind. The meta
Sure.
narratives are changing faster and faster and faster, unlike has ever been seen before. And at a certain point in time, now they're starting to be questioned more than they've ever been questioned before. And
Well,
we don't
specifically liberalism has been
liberalism,
questioned more
sure.
than it ever has. Yeah.
And it's something that's never really happened in the same in the same or in similar magnitude, right, on such a large scale, and it's causing a lot of disruption, is kind of
Well,
the
yeah, perhaps. Yes. I think, and that's a really big claim to say it's never happened. So I'm going to try to maybe dial it back just a hair and still say that it's still a huge challenge
right.
that's going on. And it was slow developing and kind of, we'll talk through the history. It's interesting where it kind of arose from. But yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, the time frame, I mean, from when America started, and we can talk more about the history, but the stuff that really influenced the founders of the country, um, if you think about what was going on then, that influenced or helped create the meta narrative of what I'm calling liberalism. But
Sure.
I think that also you have to, well, I'm not calling it that. I think liberalism is what it is. You also have to balance the science, the technology, the evolution that's going on at the same time. You have to also interplay Christianity that's going on. So there are multiple meta narrative, there are multiple narratives or stories that are going on that are shaping the way that everyone views reality
Yeah.
in the early American period. And then it really was undermined. Marxism is really that's the big first right hook that comes at it. It doesn't start here in the States, it starts overseas, and it started to spread. So, well, again, it's hard. It's really hard to just be like, hey, here's a teaser about Marxism. Like, we could
Whoa.
write a discourse about that, right?
Right.
People have. So that the history is important. What I'm trying to explain is we have to look back at the history and understand where we came from, what it did, and the benefit of it before we can start to say, here's why these other criticisms are wrong.
Sure.
So the history is going to be important. It's going to require some reading and some really deep thinking about it over a long period of time.
And
So
maybe and I guess if I may, maybe kind of the action aspect of it right now, having talked about meta narratives and maybe the call to action, the thing that we are inviting ourselves to do, but also potentially anyone else is maybe start to identify some of these meta narratives that we live in or the things that compose the meta narrative that we live in so that as we move forward, it's not so unfamiliar now that we've kind of had a broad discussion about the idea as a whole and now maybe it's what type of or what are the things that compose that and even someone should go and research it a little bit for themselves. I don't know if that's what you kind of would feel appropriate or
uh,
if you want to add anything to that.
yeah, I think that's right. I think you have to understand the framework that creates the ability to have the argument, philosophical argument. And if you can't, then it's hard to understand exactly what the opposing arguments are saying because you don't even understand what's being attacked.
Right.
It might feel like, well, it's just a different philosophical argument. I don't know. I think it's something gr- grander than that.
Sure.
It's what's shaping the viewpoint. It's shaping the perspective.
Yeah.
And the perspective allows us to then dive into the philosophies that help explain the perspective. So I think I think that's the answer, or I think that's the
Well,
clarification I would say.
we have if it's not exactly what you want to say, I'm glad that we have next week to kind of go into it
Yeah,
further. But
I'm
I think
sure. Yeah.
I think that's a great place to kind of leave off is
Okay.
we we need to explore it further. That's definitely the key from the main point of all of this is it's ongoing all the time. So
And it's hard.
yeah, a lot of work. Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah.
not going to pretend like I know it all. We have to go and read it. I think we've belabored that point enough. But
Yeah.
anyway, yeah, the call to action is read a book that talks about it.
That's great.
Just use Chat GPT and start to, figure it out. We have to have we have to be operating on the same playing field to even have substantive discussion.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's
Well, I
it
look
for me.
forward to the substantive discussion of next week. Until then.
Yeah.